We can also create textures using the texture generation tools in Corel Painter. There are several different ways to create textures using these tools. I'm going to go ahead and revert yet again to clear my texture changes here. Let's start by taking a look at making papers and flow maps. So I'm going to create a new document, and this document will define the maximum size of the paper tile. So I'm going to choose 1024 by 1024 pixels. You want to make sure that it's a square, because this is what's going to tile and create your paper texture. Next, I want to go to Window, Media Library Panels, and Patterns. And then in the Patterns tab, in the top right subdialog, I'm going to choose Define Pattern. What that's going to do is that's instantly going to transform this canvas into a canvas that wraps around as you paint. So I'll show you, for example, I'll select just the scratchboard tool and I'll start painting. And you can see that it wraps around and it loops. That way when this tiles, it'll be a repeating pattern that won't have any abrupt breaks. So I could select something like the sponge and paint in some sponge texture here and there. I could select the chalk brush, maybe take a big brush here and put in some of that. And you could feel free to experiment with other kinds of brushes as well, but let's say we want that to be our texture. What I will do is I will go to Select All, and then in the top right subdialog of the Papers panel, I will choose Capture Paper. We can call this marble since it looks kind of like marble. We'll click on OK. Now in the Paper Libraries panel, we have our marble paper. We can of course control all of the properties of it. So if we jump back over to our example and we go to the plane, we select something like the chalk brush that can use the paper grain, and we select the marble paper texture. We want to make sure that dab stencil set only to paper. I'm going to reduce the scale and play with the contrast a bit. And if we paint, we can see we're getting that very subtle marble texture. Now, if I had created a paper that was a little more obvious and less subtle, then you might be able to see that better. But this is what we get. Let's see if we can make it stand out a bit more. We'll add some more texture to this. And let's blend it a little bit using the coarse oily blender. I'll pull out some little streaks here on this using light pressure. Maybe this will be kind of like a wood texture that we're going for here. I'm just using vertical straight up and down motions. And again, we want to make sure that Select All is active. In our paper libraries, we'll go to Capture Paper, and we'll call this a wood. We'll click on OK. Now we have our wood paper, and we can jump back over to our primitives. Let's go to our cube. We'll create a new layer, set it to overlay. Let's select our wood paper. We'll select the chalk brush, and we can paint in our nice wood texture very easily there. If I want to control the scale of that, I can scale it down and I can get a finer grain. I can create additional layers, scale it up a bit, select a lighter color, and I can get different layers of wood. When I zoom in, you can see I get that nice texture. And as long as I keep this, I can use this as much as I want in my paintings now. Now, if you want to make sure that these are saved, you'll either need to export them or save your workspace. So with this selected, I can go to Paper Libraries, and I could choose Export Paper Library, and that'll save my paper library. You may even want to create your own paper library and put your custom papers into that. For example, I could create a new folder called Custom Papers. It's down here at the bottom. Now my wood paper's in there. Then of course I could delete the papers from the other library because this is just the default painter library, and just make sure that I place any custom papers in the custom papers library. That way I can export that paper library, and that'll preserve all the papers that I've created. That way if something happens and I have to reinstall Painter, I'm not going to lose those custom papers. And as I mentioned, you can also save those by saving your workspace. You do that by going to Window, Workspace, Export Workspace. Let's take a look at another way to create custom papers. In the Papers panel, let's go to the top right subdialog and let's choose Make Paper. Now we get different modes for the patterns such as halftone, line, diamond, circle, triangle, and you can get lots of different results. You can change the spacing to get more repetition or increase it to get less. And you can of course choose the angle if you want to change the angle. Let's go ahead and go with something like this, and we'll create kind of a tiled pattern. Maybe we'll just call it tiled and we'll click OK. Now we've instantly created that paper, and that appears in our Papers panel. It's also in our paper libraries. Now if I wanted to, I could take that and I could drag it down and I could put it in the other library to move it from the default library into my custom library there. I'm going to select that paper. Let's go to our sphere and let's add it to that. Set the composite method to overlay, and I'll reduce the scale of those tiles to make them smaller. And we'll select the chalk brush, make sure that that's set to use the dab stencil as paper. And there we go, I can create that tiled pattern on top of my sphere. Now it looks kind of like a disco ball. If we want it to contour to that shape, then we can select bulge, make our brush about the size of the sphere, and just paint right in the center to bulge it out like so. And now our texture wraps around the contour of our 3D object. Now one thing I notice is that the lighting's not correct in my texture, so I'm going to go back a few steps here, and I'm just going to rotate so that my lighting is coming from the top, like so. I'll return to my chalk brush, I'll paint that texture back in again, go back to my bulge brush, and inflate that, and now our lighting is going in the right direction. I could of course play with the composite method too to get some different results. Multiply makes it look kind of indented, screen makes it bulge out a lot more. You could even try difference to get a really wacky result there, kind of like the way multiply looked the best. Let's take a look at yet another way to generate textures. I'm going to go ahead and create a new canvas. I'm going to choose 1024 by 1024. Let's go to Effects, Esoterica, Custom Tile. Now we can create a brick pattern, a hexagonal pattern, a square pattern, triangle. You can feel free to go through all of these. Let's try hexagonal. I'm going to make the scale larger, reduce the blur radius and the blur passes, and increase the grout thickness quite a bit. Maybe that'll be our texture. I'll click on OK. Then we'll go to Select All, and in the Papers panel in the top right sub-dialog, we'll choose Capture Paper. We'll call it Hex. We'll click on OK. Now we have our hexagonal paper. We can jump back over to our primitive shapes. Let's go ahead and add that to the cone. I'm going to select the cone layer, right-click, choose Select Layer Content, create a new layer. Let's set that to Screen. Let's select our hexagonal paper. We'll choose the chalk brush, and we'll reduce the scale a bit so we have smaller hexagons, and we'll go ahead and paint that in. Now if we want this to fit the contour of the cone, we'll again need to choose the bulge brush, and we'll bulge right down the center, and that'll help inflate it and help it fit the contour of the cone a little bit better. Another option would be to paint in the hexagons like this, and then go to Edit, Free Transform, choose Perspective Distortion. I'm going to pull out the corner here and then hold Alt to constrain it. If I pull it out into kind of a triangle like this, I'm going to click on the check to commit. Then I can make those hexagons get smaller at the tip, but my texture goes off of my object, so I'll need to right-click on the cone, select Layer Content, click back on the texture layer, go to Select Invert Selection, and then hit Delete or go to Edit Clear to shave off that outer area there. And I can deselect with Control D. Let's play with a different composite method to get a different look as well. And I'll reduce the opacity a bit. And again, I can choose Select Layer Content on the cone, hide the selection, go back to the texture layer, and then I can use the bulge brush to help it look more three-dimensional. Now if I use a smaller brush kind of near the tip and a bigger brush near the bottom, that's really going to help it look a little more correct. But if I zoom out, I think something like that works. And that gives you a nice custom tile pattern for something like lizard scales. Now, just like you can make papers, you could also make flow maps, and the advantage to that is flow maps work with watercolor papers, and you can use the flow map dab stencil while also using the paper grain. It's the same process, you just click up in the top right sub-dialog, and you choose Capture Flow Map rather than Capture Paper. You can also capture a flow map from the currently selected paper, so if I wanted to make a flow map out of the hex, I could do that. Now let's take a look at one last way to generate textures here in Corel Painter. In the Patterns panel, we'll click on the top right sub-dialog and we'll choose Make Fractal Pattern. If we play with these different sliders, we can get bigger or broader cloudy shapes. We can decrease or increase the feature size if we want it to be small and grainy or big and fluffy. We can control the softness and hardness. We can control the angle or the thinness. So you can see I can make it nice and streaky and then rotate it around. And then we can choose the size of the tile. So I'm going to choose 1024. I think something like that will work, so I'll click on OK. That automatically creates a new canvas with our fractal pattern. Then we can simply go to Select All. And let's make a flow map this time. In our Flow Maps panel, let's go to Capture Flow Map. We'll call this Diagonal. I'll click on OK. And you can see in my Flow Maps panel, I now have that diagonal flow map. If I go to my plane here in my primitives, And if I want to select something like the chalk brush, and then select the flow map for the dab stencil and then choose diagonal, I'm going to decrease the scale of that, and then I can paint it in here on my plane, and I can get that nice striped kind of zebra or animal stripe pattern there. If I want to rotate it, I could take it and rotate it the other direction, choose a lighter color, and I can put in some of that here and there. And that gives me options for creating all kinds of fractal patterns.